Mr. Vice President, distinguished delegates, members of civil society, especially Afghanistan human rights defenders. As noted in my report, while there are a few pockets of hope, which I've strived to identify, overall, the human rights situation has not improved since I addressed this Council last September. It continues to deteriorate, and once again, my report depicts a stark reality. Despite competing priorities, it's imperative for this Council to keep Afghanistan and its people at the forefront of your agenda. As the Secretary-General said following a meeting in Doha last week, there is agreement that we want an Afghanistan that's at peace with itself and its neighbors. As is universally the case, respect for human rights must be the cornerstone of that goal, and I implore all stakeholders to embrace this principle. Afghans approached me regularly to demand demonstrated, measurable, and independently verified improvements in respect for international human rights treaties before any normalization or integration of Afghanistan back into the international community is considered. Such improvements should be benchmarks as proposed in the recent independent assessment submitted to the Security Council. I also reiterate that a stable, rights-respecting future requires that long-standing impunity be tackled. I support the ongoing international accountability efforts and encourage collaboration within accountability processes in domestic jurisdictions for past and current violations by all parties to the conflict in Afghanistan, including for gender justice and attacks on ethnic and religious communities. The investigations by the International Criminal Court are in full swing, and I'm also hopeful that other avenues of accountability will be used. States parties to the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against all forms of discrimination against women possess authority to initiate a case against Afghanistan at the International Court of Justice for non-compliance with the Convention. I encourage state parties to consider this legal pathway to challenge these violations. Mr. Vice President, the de facto authorities have created a national system in which the discrimination, segregation, oppression, and exclusion of women and girls is institutionalized. I repeat my previous analysis that the situation amounts to persecution based on gender, which is a crime against humanity within the Rome Statute. I'll go further and say that it may be characterized as gender apartheid, as the de facto authorities appear to be governing by systematic discrimination with the intention to subject women and girls to total domination. As mandated, I'll be undertaking a deeper analysis of these issues and will brief the Council during the upcoming June session. This is anathema to human rights standards and the fight for gender equality and has implications for accelerating a global rollback on women and girls' rights. It's important to hold the Taliban to account for their policies and actions. And most of all, perhaps, it's important for member states to find ways to support the women and girls of Afghanistan and the men and boys in bringing about the change that's needed for them to realize their human rights as soon as possible. This environment appears to be having a severe impact on the mental health of the whole population, and especially on women and girls, with widespread reports of depression and suicide, especially among adolescents. According to recent surveys of Afghan women, their perception of the possibility of international recognition is one of the greatest stress factors. In addition, Afghanistan is missing out on the contribution of women and girls in terms of social, economic, cultural, and political development. Earlier this year, the Taliban started to harshly implement their dress code for women and girls in several cities and provinces, arbitrarily detaining dozens on claims that their hijab was insufficient. These arrests clearly infringe women and girls' right to privacy and self-expression, further curtailing their agency. The responsibility for their release was placed on their male relatives, who were coerced into signing guarantees that their female relatives would adhere to the prescribed dress code in future. As I've noted previously, The Taliban do not tolerate any dissenting voices and have arbitrarily arrested education advocates, women human rights defenders, journalists, and artists. I reiterate my call for the immediate and unconditional release of all human rights defenders, especially those standing up for gender equality, including Fahim Azizi, Siddiqullah Afghan, and Manisa Siddiqui. Civic space has also shrunk further as the Taliban has intensified their censoring of books that they deem to be contrary to Sharia, national values, and Afghan culture. All of the above, combined with the arbitrary and capricious nature of the implementation of policies, has worsened a climate of fear. I want to also draw your urgent attention to the dire circumstances facing the children of Afghanistan. The right to education remains a distant dream for many, particularly beyond the 6th grade for girls, effectively extinguishing the hopes and aspirations of a generation yearning for knowledge and progress. The situation is further exacerbated by the alarming prevalence of child labor and forced and underage marriage. Young girls and boys are being thrust into adult roles with grave implications for their psychological and physical well-being. More than a third of children are compelled to work to support their families. Girls and those with disabilities disproportionately suffer from severe hunger. These practices not only violate the most basic human rights, but also undermine the very fabric of society, perpetuating cycles of poverty and despair. I call on the de facto authorities and the international community to address these violations and to ensure that the children of Afghanistan are afforded the opportunities and protections they deserve. My report also gives more detailed information about the discrimination and violence against LGBTIQ+ people who too often go unheard and unseen, as well as the difficult situation of persons with disabilities, especially when it comes to access to humanitarian aid and representation. Mr. Vice President, as I've noted previously, the Taliban do not uphold their own commitments, disrespecting their own amnesty for former government officials and security personnel and their guidance on the treatment of prisoners. They continue to torture and ill-treat detainees and to inflict cruel and degrading punishments. In the last 2 weeks, there were public executions and/or floggings in the provinces of Bamiyan, Ghazni, Jawzjan, and Laghman, in contradiction to international human rights commitments made by Afghanistan. Ethnic and religious minorities are under more pressure. An increase in targeted attacks on the Hazara Shia community during the reporting period, often claimed by Islamic State KP, has reinforced the climate of fear among religious and ethnic minorities. Many feel vulnerable, discriminated against, underrepresented, and treated unfairly by the de facto authorities, including in terms of land disputes. Afghanistan remains caught in the throes of a profound humanitarian crisis, with an overwhelming almost 24 million Afghans needing aid, including 15 million children. The need is mounting for humanitarian support to high numbers of Afghans forced to leave neighboring countries and due to ongoing, often climate-induced natural disasters, including recent landslides in Nuristan. Noting an increased funding gap in 2023, I call on you to increase funding that will enable the people of Afghanistan to better exercise their social, economic, and cultural rights. Long-term support of education, for example, that's not covered by humanitarian funds should be addressed. However, I note that widening the scope and increasing the levels of funding shouldn't be mistaken for legitimization of the Taliban. Mr. Vice President, Afghanistan's future should include the full, equal, and meaningful participation and respect for the human rights of its people in all their diversity, including with regard to gender and all linguistic, ethnic, religious, and other minorities. In particular, Afghanistan stands alone in the scale of its deplorable treatment of women and girls. It's vital that the international community is steadfast in this respect. To do otherwise would send a concerning message about their commitment to women everywhere. I urge you to stand together for the human rights of the people of Afghanistan. The people deserve to decide and be consulted on the way forward to an Afghanistan where the international human rights obligations are respected. For Afghanistan at peace in the long term, with itself and its neighbors, I repeat. And I reiterate my calls on the Taliban to improve their human rights record and building on the small gains made already in the private and health sectors. Human rights are the cornerstone of sustainable, long-lasting peace. And last but not least, I pay tribute to the many brave Afghan human rights defenders who continue to stand up for human rights, for the human rights of their people. I thank you.